what have the Guatemalans contributed to the tech industry? Probably something. I've never heard of it. I would say Ukraine, honestly, is by almost all measures not a good place to live, never was. When immigrants very vocally do things that horrify people, well, that's very unfortunate. And so every time you've got a pro-Palestinian demonstration, I think this is hurting the prospects of Middle Eastern immigrants, because that one is sufficiently visible and it does scare people for pretty obvious reasons. The United States in tech is clearly the most innovative. We leave the rest of the world in our dust. The obvious story is they just need to become more like us.
Okay, so let's talk about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I would like to ask you one migration-connected question. So what do you think about the take that we can measure the success of Ukraine and the West in this war by the percentage of Ukrainian population that is going to end up in free societies? And so it can be Ukraine, it can be Poland, Germany, it can be United States. So this is one of the measures. What do you think about this take?
So the take is the success of the war depends upon the fraction of Ukrainians that live somewhere good.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I mean, I would say Ukraine, honestly, is by almost all measures not a good place to live, never was. So, like, as to whether, just by that standard, I say that as an excuse to go and let tons of Ukrainians go and move to the rest of Europe, that is the silver lining of an otherwise tragic situation.
Yeah, because the idea is that even if the war is not going to end up very well for Ukraine, at least if significant portion of the Ukrainian population is going to end up in freer societies, so it could be still a good outcome and potential opportunities.
An outcome that didn't require a war. If you think that Ukrainians in the rest of the EU is a good idea, could have been done before, right?
Yeah, of course, but politicians would not do that without a war, obviously. So yeah, that's true. And what do you think about diaspora effects? Because you were writing a lot about diaspora effects. And of course, if we have migrants from certain area and gradually costs of migration become lower because of lower information costs, lower costs of like communication because it's easier for them to communicate with their co-ethnics, lower costs like psychological costs, etc., etc. And of course, there are huge economic benefits from migration in general, for migrants themselves, for their countries of origin, also for receiving countries. But if diaspora effects are so strong, and they're strong not just when we have free movement of people, even if we have migration barriers, still it's getting easier for people to migrate when there are already some of their co-ethnics or people from their country in the destination society. So what do you think about inducing these first movers, like creating some kind of migration policies which subsidize first or making it much easier for migrants to move from countries? They don't have a lot of immigrants in this particular society yet, in this particular destination country.
I'd say it's pretty silly to worry about subsidizing migrants when you have a massive policy system dedicated to keeping them out. The obvious thing is to cut it back. I'd say that there's strong signs that if there are even medium costs of migrating, if you don't go and have very harsh penalties for migration, then it naturally goes to a quite high level in a fairly short amount of time. If you just look at the percentage of people of Mexican origin that now live in the United States, it's high. And this is despite the strong efforts of the U.S. to go and keep Mexicans out this entire time.
Yeah, but the idea is to create such special preferences for people from rare origins, because long-term effects can be especially large, because they not just they are going to benefit from it, but also future migrants from the same origin.
Again, it's just like, given that the destination countries are trying very hard to keep people out, to say let's also offset it with some subsidy for doing it, I say is pretty pointless.
But not necessarily subsidy, maybe easier routes, maybe less.
If you want to go and relax the rules, great. But it's one where if you just got a hard quota of number of migrants that you get in and you say, let's go and do something in order to get people from Gambia in, it's like, all right, well, given that rule, then it's just spending money to go and reallocate the number of people, but makes a lot more sense to focus on trying to get the quota up.
Yeah, for this particular kind. But the issue is that in some cases, the restrictions are not just about quotas, because it's also about particular requirements. Because, for example, in Europe, there are a lot of migration programs that are not limited by quotas, but limited by fulfilling particular requirements. And it could be 5,000 people who fulfill these
Okay,
requirements. It
that's fair
could be
enough.
50,000 people.
Yep.
So, and if you relax requirements from people from certain groups, you can significantly increase migration, because they're not going to end up running into some kind of quota, because most of migration in European countries are not governed by quotas, but by some kind of criteria that people have to fulfill.
Yeah, that's reasonable enough. So if you do have rules like that, where it's just everyone who's over this threshold can get in, then if you can figure out some way of doing it, great. Again, it's one where ultimately I don't think that you're going to get much movement there. Philanthropists could try doing it. To get a country that's trying to keep out people to go and also policies to get them in, I guess stranger things have happened. The United States traditionally both subsidizes and taxes tobacco. But
And what do you think about private efforts to help migration? How effective they can be, how much difference they can make?
It really depends upon the details of the legal system. If you've got one where there's a fixed quota and there's not much you can do, sometimes you're right that it is one where it's any number of people get over a certain threshold. In that case, if you've got some philanthropy and can help them get over that threshold, great. That can make a big difference and can be an amplified difference if once they're in, they can start helping their friends and relatives.
Yeah, and let's go back a little bit towards this argument about how population size affects innovation, your recent post about your discussion with Matt Ridley. And the idea here is, I mostly agree with your argument that, of course, both population size and interconnectedness affects the speed of innovation. But there were recently some papers that argue that when, once again, interconnectedness is too strong, it can actually slow down innovation, because we don't have enough development of technologies in different directions. As a result of it, once again, conformism presses, even in these innovative areas, people to follow certain routes instead of trying different routes. And do you think we are at some point at risk of hitting this point where we have too much interconnectedness?
I'm not familiar with the papers you're talking about. All I would say is, if we look at the world right now, the United States in tech is clearly the most innovative. The rest, we leave the rest of the world in our dust. The obvious story is they just need to become more like us so they can start doing more. And you might say, well, wouldn't we be losing something? It's not clear we're losing anything. It's like, well, what have the Guatemalans contributed to the tech industry? Probably something. I've never heard of it. And then how is Guatemala going to contribute more? I think they need to Americanize more. And if they Americanize enough, then they'll start pulling their population weighted weight.
Yeah, so at least at this point, it's pretty clear which countries are the drivers of innovation. Of course, like 55% of unicorn startups are in the United States, and if countries are going to Americanize more, so potentially at least adopt some of the cultural norms, they are going to be more contributive to innovation. Yeah, but these papers will, once again, they're more like theoretical, based on experiments. When you separate people into groups and then look if they like push 50 people together, how fast they find the solutions, or you separate them in 10 groups of 5.
Yeah, so in that case, I do know about some of these papers. It's like, all right, whatever. This is not important for the real world, at least at that level.
Yeah, so of course, it's not directly applicable. We cannot say that.
It's directly contradicted by the major patterns that we see. So, I mean, it all sort of begins with the idea of we totally don't know what the best route is. And sometimes that's true. Other times you got a very clear idea about what the best route is. If you don't know, then yeah, having lots of different variation is helpful, because lots of different ideas might turn out to be right. Once you figure out the right idea, then you don't want variation anymore. Do we really need to go and have some countries switch to Roman numerals? It's like, all right, well, it's a bad way of doing math. Everyone should just do Arabic numerals. That's the good way. And like to say, well, how do we know there won't eventually be some math problems where Roman numerals will be a better way? All right, we don't know for sure, but come on, we're not going to do Roman numerals. That sounds like a total waste of time. And stop, let's focus on what we actually know we need to improve on, instead of this idle speculation about some alternate future where we reach a dead end because of Arabic numerals.
Yeah. So basically, the idea is better to expect variation along some kind of new dimensions, which we haven't figured out yet. So something we have already figured out, and homogenization in this regard, in terms of these cultural traits or these technologies, it would be better for the world. But we probably are going to have some kind of variation along new traits, which are still not clear which of them are going to be beneficial and which are not. Something like that.
Yeah. I mean, like I said, like the one thing that poor countries are doing a lot better on than rich countries is fertility. That's an issue. Right? As to what's going on, it's complicated. Um, there's plenty that could be done by rich countries if they actually cared about this issue. Hardly anybody does. Again, it's not one where it's like, well, if we just had more cultural competition, then maybe we would go and start having higher fertility rates. It's like, I just don't think that's a likely mechanism. You've got to go and get the cultures that are working on other measures to say, hey, we're doing really great on everything except this one thing. Let's try to figure out how to improve on that.
Yeah, and it's also not completely clear that they're doing better if you adjust, for example, for GDP level, when currently rich countries have the same level of GDP as currently poor countries have now. They had much higher fertility rates. Like when the United States had GDP per capita of Turkey, fertility rates in the United States were like several times higher, because now actually Turkey has lower fertility than the United States.
Yeah, we've been better at exporting our fertility norms than exporting our productivity norms.
If you have enjoyed this video so far, please share, like, and subscribe. Your support would greatly help to keep this young channel going and growing.
Yeah. So, and what do you think about migration policy? If, for example, we have charter cities, would you support open borders? Would you support open borders with fees, or open borders with one-time payments on annual fees? Something. What would be your policy for charter city with respect to migration?
For a charter city, I guess I would just start by talking to people already there. My best guess is the whole idea of a charter city is you do it in a fairly remote area, and you probably want to get rapid population growth in order to reap the benefits, at least initially. Again, once it's functional, then maybe you would say, well, we only want to let people in with a fee or something like that. It's complicated because essentially it means that you are really more like a landlord than you are like a country. So it does make more sense to be saying, well, we sort of have like a fixed amount of space here, at least in the medium term. So we'll be thinking about exactly who we want to let in. The main thing with a country is normally you just don't have much of a trade-off. You could let in almost any number of people in at least most countries you've heard of. For a very small one, it's a different story. And like I said, like if you just put me in charge of a charter city and said, what should we do? Then yeah, I think I would say, yeah, let's just open borders. Anyone who wants to come here, the more the merrier. We want to grow our population real fast. We want to get big and start reaping all of these positive externalities of population.
Yeah, and of course that's why potentially charter city is more likely to be successful if you put it somewhere near already existing large cities, so you can at least somehow benefit from network effects. Like
it's just the problem that those are ones the government isn't likely to give you permission to.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Like, well, you want to go and make New York City prime right next to New York City. They're not going to give you that permission. It's got to be somewhere where nobody is, where they say, all right, fine, you can do your weird thing over here.
Yes, but with basically new technologies, when distance is not as important as in the past, potentially it can work even in slightly more remote locations. Because of remote working, because of the potential in the future also faster transportation, etc. Potentially it can work, but so near large cities now it's hard to do unless it's a government run project. So, and what do you think about migration policies which short of completely open borders, but theoretically possible to implement? For example, policies with potential to grow exponentially in terms of received migrants, or at least grow to some degree without additional government imposed changes. So, for example, you pass a law that anyone who comes from the country with GDP above $20,000 is allowed into our society. As a result of it, we have basically a policy which is introduced once, but then over time it leads to higher and higher migration without any need for additional policy reforms. So as a result of it, you create policies with potential to grow, but without these potentially risky points where it can be revoked, or it would require additional authorization, etc., etc.
Yeah, sounds like a fantastic improvement over what we got. All for it.
And what do you think about the concept of brain gain? So when basically, obviously, migrants attracted to potential opportunities that exist abroad, and then as a result of it, receive additional education just for migration purposes.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that you're skeptical about education in general, but we all obviously have like obvious skills like language skills and things like that are obviously useful. And these migration opportunities induce human capital accumulation in developing countries.
Mm-hmm.
And do you think it would be helpful to design policies along these lines that induce brain gain? If you have, for example, limited amount of places available for migration, why wouldn't we, for example, reform American diversity visa lottery to introduce some language requirements, but increasing number of places, and as a result of it is still going to attract significant number of migrants, but also stimulate people to learn English or add some other requirements like that?
Yep, reasonable. My colleague Michael Clemens is one of the main people that's worked on this, and his key point was that since Filipinos who have medical skills have a much greater chance of getting a visa, a lot of Filipinos go and get trained as doctors and nurses purely for this migration opportunity. Most don't get it. And the net result is that Filipinos actually have better access to trained health professionals than if there were not this lottery ticket of maybe I'll get to go and make a lot more money in another country. And yeah, same thing goes for other policies. I mean, the truth is that the way that you go and get people to do these things is precisely by saying that if you want to come, you've got to go and get these special skills. It doesn't help very much if only you have to be the best person in your country. So you need to have standards that are not that hard to meet if you want to get a large response.
Yeah. And what do you think about migration policy, which still allows more people in, but introduces some kind of harsher assimilation policies on top of that? So even though it might be not necessary, because we can argue that migrants are assimilating relatively quickly anyway, but just to satisfy a local population and reduce opposition from various parts of the society, it might be a good trade-off to introduce some kind of policies which introduce harsher assimilation criteria, but also on the other hand, increase number of migrants allowed into the country. What would you think about that?
So it just depends upon how true it is that you'll raise support for immigration by having more assimilation requirements. My view is that most people don't like immigration. They're very stubborn about it. It's not based upon statistical study of average degree of cultural fit between migrants and their home country. It's more one based upon what's the scariest story you can put in the news. The scariest story you put in the news is really barely limited by the average quality of the immigrants, because you just find the worst one. That's going to be generally something terrible. So as long as people's views are shaped by like which immigrant was meanest to his pets, let's have a story about the immigrant dog abuser. Like as long as that's the kind of stuff that is the basis for people's views, then it really doesn't make much difference in terms of whether you change things. And I would say that when immigrants very vocally do things that horrify people, well, that's very unfortunate. And so every time you've got a pro-Palestinian demonstration, I think this is hurting the prospects of Middle Eastern immigrants, because that one is sufficiently visible and it does scare people for pretty obvious reasons. Most obviously, like, do you start by saying that you are totally opposed to Hamas and you want to have peace at any price? No? Well, that's the problem. You need to say we want peace at any price. That's what would put people's minds at rest.
And what do you think about, if we go back to the issue of fertility, which policy would you be most favorable towards? For example, baby bonus or baby bonds, when people receive some money which are invested in the stock market, in index funds, or in bonds when the child is born, or just as Robin Hansen idea to give parents a share of children's future income? What would be your proposal at this point?
I think the simplest thing is also probably the best. It's just to give parents a tax holiday of a year or 2 years or 5 years or whatever you think for every kid they have. And this fits in with people are myopic. So it's not that helpful in terms of response to say 50 years from now, we'll give you a better Social Security check. And I think that would probably be a good idea too, to say the Social Security payments are going to be based partly on fertility. But I think this is just the simplest one. Say, look, you had a kid this year. All right, you don't pay any taxes this year, or maybe for more years. Hungary has one that sounds really good, where if a woman has 4 kids, she doesn't have to pay any income taxes for the rest of her life. The problem is very few women with 4 kids actually have high-paid jobs, so it doesn't really do that much. What about us dads of 4 kids? So anyway, I think my idea makes more sense. And I do have a piece where I go over both estimates of the fiscal benefit of new babies combined with the responsiveness of fertility to incentives, showing that my idea actually is a tax cut that in fact raises taxes in the long run. So it's sort of the holy grail of tax policy, where you can raise more revenue by taxing less.
Yeah, because lifetime earnings of this child are going to significantly exceed the amount that you...
Particularly lifetime tax payments in expected value. Yes, not just earnings.
Yeah, but of course, for the government, the key issue is a lifetime tax payment, but for society as a whole, lifetime productivity is more important.
What an amazing world it would be if that was what governments cared about.
Yeah.
Right?
There's the same stories about...
Politicians seem to barely care at all about the future. So it's like, well, whatever happens in the future happens. It's just the next elections what I care about.
Yeah, the same way like when we hear about discussion with respect to government or immigrant tax contribution, and very often we don't even take into account that, for example, firms for which these migrants work also pay taxes, like corporate taxes, etc., and they would not pay them without immigrants who work for them. That was the idea of this is one of the papers of Michael Clemens.
Yes, that's right. It's a very good point that Michael made, and one that, as far as I know, no one else was making. So good job.
And these recent papers from Europe, which study net impact of migrants from culturally distant regions or non-Western countries, they are not taking this into account. So that's why this is basically the interesting idea here is that Michael Clemens, it's the only person who so far took this into account. But we obviously should go even further and think about actual productivity gain, not just the gain in terms of tax revenues. Okay, and so now let's just probably finish for today. Thank you very much.
Sure thing.
It was great conversation. Do you want to talk about your upcoming book or say something about that?
Sure. All right. Yes, my upcoming book is called Build, Baby, Build, The Science and Ethics of Housing Regulation. It's coming out on May 1st. You can already pre-order it. This is, like my book, Open Borders, a nonfiction graphic novel. If you're not familiar with the genre, think of a documentary comic book. So it's nonfiction, but told using the style of comic books. A lot of the motive, like, why would you do that? That's really weird. Like, well, there's all this great research out there. It's important, but it's boring. Hardly anyone wants to go and read papers estimating the effect of housing regulation on the price of housing or inequality or whatever. So I'm trying to go and use this format to make the evidence a lot more entertaining. And I think I do succeed. I'm really trying to go and get people to spend more time thinking about it, and also take advantage of the fact that a picture is proverbially worth 1,000 words. So I can get more of your time and I can teach you more per minute, all while putting it into a big picture package. And the big picture I have is this. Housing deregulation is a panacea policy. Panacea meaning an all cure literally. Of course, it isn't literally an all cure, but rather housing deregulation simultaneously makes a big dent in a long list of seemingly unrelated problems that people are complaining about. Housing deregulation doesn't just make housing cheaper. It raises economic productivity by making it cheaper to move to high productivity areas of the country. It reduces poverty. It increases social mobility. It reduces inequality. Raises environmental quality. That one's a little more complicated, but it does. Reduces crime by encouraging people to build stuff on vacant lots. Raises fertility by making it cheaper for people to not live in their parents' basement and have a reasonable amount of living space per person. All these things that seem unrelated, people are complaining about. Housing deregulation is a policy that, through an amazing coincidence, it is a very effective remedy for all of these problems simultaneously and many more. Anyway, my belief is I have written the most fascinating book ever written on housing regulation, which, all right, great. I think it's actually going to keep people on the edge of their seats. Hopefully I'm right.
Yes, I also believe that it's going to be a pretty interesting book because housing regulation is
Pretty
slowing
interesting,
down.
hey. Pretty interesting. Now,
I mean, amazing, because I think
Fascinating.
housing regulation is one of the problems that we have today that slows down all the potential benefits from all the other processes,
Yeah.
from migration, from internal migration, international migration, slows
Mhm.
down innovation because it does not allow people to come to places like Silicon Valley in larger quantities. And basically slows down our progress along all of these dimensions. And so, of
Yep.
course, I liked your Open Borders book a lot. I gave it the present to many of my friends. So,
Great.
and I think it's going to be an amazing book, obviously.
All right. Awesome.
Thank you. Thank you,
May
Bryan.
1st. May 1st. And
May 1st.
everybody's invited to the big book party at the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C. on April 30th. Look it up.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed our conversation, please like and subscribe. I would also be very grateful if you could share this video with your friends. It really helps. We are planning interviews with public intellectuals, entrepreneurs, and researchers. We have already recorded multiple episodes and will post them in the coming weeks. We are also planning conversations in a diverse range of languages, fully dubbed in English, to present ideas and opinions from around the world. Your attention and support are crucial for making our plans happen. Thank you.